Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Every December, like clockwork, my family sends out a glossy holiday card, the kind that shows up in shiny envelopes with gold lettering, the kind people stick to their fridges with decorative magnets or prop up on mantles beside scented candles, the kind that makes strangers believe we are the picture of unity and warmth. And every year, when those cards find their way into the homes of extended relatives and old neighbors, there is one glaring omission: me. I have never once been in those photos, not as a teenager awkwardly holding a mug of cocoa, not as a college student home for winter break, not as an adult with a life of my own. It started with excuses that felt like accidents at first. Oh, you weren't here that day. We'll make sure you're in the next one. But the years rolled on, and somehow the tradition hardened into a habit, and the habit into a statement. At first, it was humiliating in small ways. I would visit an aunt's house and see the framed card on the wall, my parents and my brother grinning in coordinated sweaters while I stood there, sipping cider, very much alive, very much present, yet erased. Sometimes people would ask where I was, and my family had stock phrases ready. She was busy with school. She couldn't make it. She's always running around with work. And I would laugh awkwardly, because what else can you do? And then I would go home and sit with the realization that my own family preferred the version of life where I did not exist. Over time, it stopped being an accident and became a message carved into glossy paper: you don't belong in this story. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't care, that holiday cards were nothing more than cheap paper and fake smiles. But it did matter, more than I wanted to admit, because every card was like a public announcement of my absence, a reminder to every cousin and second cousin, every family friend who had watched me grow up, that I was somehow invisible, a shadow in my own bloodline. And if I dared to bring it up, I was brushed aside with dismissive humor, like I was being dramatic, like I was making problems out of nothing. "Don't be sensitive," my mom would say. "You know how these things are." Except I did know how these things were. They were deliberate, sharp, and cruel. The worst part was the contrast. My brother, Matthew, was always dead center, practically glowing, the very image of the son they had always dreamed of raising. His tie was straight, his posture confident, his smile wide enough to make any parent beam with pride. He could have flunked a semester or crashed a car, and still he would be the golden boy holding the family together in a perfect frame. Meanwhile, I learned to live with the silence that came after my own milestones. The scholarship I fought tooth and nail for earned me a passing, that's nice. My first real promotion at work was answered with a distracted "good for you." Their holiday cards made it official. Matthew was the one worth presenting to the world. Still, I kept showing up. Year after year, I came home for Christmas dinners, sat at the same table, passed the mashed potatoes, laughed at recycled jokes, and watched them take the photo without me. I told myself maybe next year would be different. Maybe one day they would remember I was part of this family. But I should have known better, because people who enjoy erasing you rarely give up the power of pretending you don't exist. This past year, though, it reached a new level. I wasn't just excluded from the card, I wasn't even invited to be in the house when they took it. No phone call, no text, not even a last-minute, half-hearted invitation to drop by if you want. I learned about the gathering the way strangers would, through social media. There it was, the brand new holiday photo, posted with cheerful captions, hashtags about family love and holiday cheer, and the bold words, "All of us together for the holidays." All of us. The phrase slammed into me like a punch, because there they were, smiling in their matching outfits in front of Grandma's fireplace, and there I wasn't. I stared at the photo for longer than I should have, watching the likes roll in, the comments from neighbors and family friends about how beautiful the picture was, how wonderful it must be to have a family so close-knit. Not a single person noticed the missing daughter. Or maybe they did and just thought better than to say anything, because who wants to be the one to point out the fracture in someone else's perfect portrait? I should have been numb by now, but I wasn't. I felt the old anger rise, mixing with something sharper, something final. Because this year, it wasn't just an oversight, and it wasn't just tradition. It was intentional. They had built a holiday narrative without me, and they had the nerve to declare it complete, as though my existence was nothing but static in their broadcast of family unity. And in that moment, sitting in my apartment with the glow of their photo burning through my phone screen, I realized I was done being their shadow. I wasn't going to quietly accept the erasure anymore, not when I had already built a life that was louder, bolder, and far more successful than anything they pretended to celebrate in those cards. They thought they had written me out of the story, but they didn't realize I had been drafting a new chapter of my own. And this year, I wasn't just going to show them I was still here, I was going to make it impossible for them, and for everyone else, to look away. Matthew has always understood the choreography of our family better than anyone, not because he is cruel or particularly strategic, but because he figured out early that if you stand in the center of the frame, keep your chin lifted, and give people the confident smile they want to see, they will forgive almost anything, and so he coasted through adolescence on a wave of generous interpretations while I learned the quieter art of swallowing commentary whole, which, as it turns out, is not a skill that keeps you sane when the same scene repeats for years with only the sweaters changing color. At school events, my mother would grip my elbow long enough to whisper that I should not make this about me. At dinner, my father would interrupt my small triumphs with a well-timed question about Matthew's plans. And at holidays, the script was so polished I could have delivered the lines for everyone. Mom praising Matthew's reliability, Dad admiring his practicality, Grandma Ruth pinching his cheek as if he were still 12, and me clearing plates because movement was easier than being trapped by their gentle condescension. I learned to laugh through the soft insults that hide inside compliments, the way my mother would say I was so driven in the same tone she reserved for a stubborn stain, or how my father would marvel at my work ethic with a shrug that implied I was compensating for a personality deficit, and I told myself I did not need their approval because my life had a different rhythm. Yet when the Christmas photo appeared with the caption that claimed we were all together, something inside me snapped. In that slow, deliberate way a hairline crack widens when you pour cold water over hot glass, quiet at first and then irreversible. I scrolled through the comments from relatives who had known me since I was small enough to be hoisted onto Uncle James's shoulders at parades, and I wondered whether they simply did not notice the absence or whether it had become convenient for everyone to believe the fantasy, because fantasies are tidy and they fit on a fridge. I will admit I considered rage, the kind that explodes and leaves you empty, but anger has never been my sharpest tool, so I did what I have always done when the ground tilts under me. I began to plan, not a grand spectacle, not yet, but a measured, almost petty act that would let me breathe without apologizing for taking up air. I opened a drawer where I keep the sort of office supplies that make people joke about my spreadsheet soul, label maker tape, archival pens, double-sided dots, and I pulled out a sheet of tiny photo stickers I had printed months ago for a project that never happened, a strip of my own face cropped close, the same wry half smile I wear when I am deciding whether to keep the peace or choose myself. The next day, I made a circuit of houses under the cover of holiday errands, carrying tins of cookies like a polite insurgent, and everywhere I saw that glossy card displayed on mantels, in hallways, beside bowls of peppermint candy, I pressed one of those stickers into a corner of the frame, not over their faces, not vandalizing the presentation, just adding a small truth to the edge of their fiction, my tiny portrait peeking in as if to say, "You forgot something, and I am reminding you in the smallest possible font." I thought it would feel childish, and maybe it was, but the first time I stepped back and saw my face reflected in the glass beside their choreographed happiness, I felt a steadiness I had not felt in years. The calm that comes when you align your actions with your own version of events rather than theirs. At Aunt Linda's, I chatted about ornaments while my fingers worked quickly. At Cousin Jenna's, I complimented her new backsplash while my stickers slid into place. At Grandma Ruth's, where the card rested on the piano next to a porcelain angel, I waited until she left the room to stir the cider, and I tucked my small portrait along the lower edge, hardly visible unless you leaned in, which, to be fair, is what I had been asking them to do for years. By the time I reached my car, the group text had already begun humming with the genteel outrage that passes for conflict in my family, my mother asking if anyone else's card had a smudge, my father suggesting someone must have bumped a frame, Matthew sending a laughing face that somehow carried the weight of a jab, and then Grandma, who rarely texted, asking a single question that made me pause over the steering wheel. Is that our girl? I typed and erased 3 different replies, because part of me wanted to say yes and invite the explosion, while another part wanted to let the silence do its work, and in the end I sent nothing. Because the point was not to argue, but to place a mirror where a wall had been, to show them, and maybe myself, that I could change the picture without begging to be included. When I got home, I opened my laptop and pulled up a document I had titled half as a joke and half as a promise, holiday counter-programming, a list of small, surgical moves that would not require shouting or pleading, moves that would build toward something larger without telegraphing my hand, and I added a new line beneath the others, a reminder to follow up on a conversation I had had months ago with a media buyer who owed me a favor from a charity auction. I wrote down the cost estimates, the lead time, the dimensions, and the one location that mattered more than any other, the block in front of Grandma's building where the family always gathered to pose under the window like a stage. And, because victory tastes better when it is plated with humor, I ended the day by sending my parents a cheerful e-card designed to look like a holiday newsletter. A tidy paragraph that wished them love and health and included a single sentence that read like a joke until you held it a second longer than comfort allowed. Please note, all statements claiming all of us will be corrected for accuracy in future printings. And I watched the read receipts arrive without a reply, which was fine. Because replies had never been the point, not for them and finally not for me either, and as I closed my laptop I caught my reflection in the dark screen and recognized the look I wore, the one I save for negotiations where the other side assumes I will fold. The phone vibrated again with a message from Grandma, just 3 words this time, tender and disarming and a little terrifying in how much they asked of me. Come by tomorrow? Grandma's message sat on my screen like a small worm stone in a pocket, and even though part of me wanted to ignore it, because softness has a way of untying knots I had worked hard to secure, I found myself climbing the stairs to her apartment the next afternoon with a bakery box in my hands and a speech rehearsed in my head. The kind you compose when you think you might need to defend yourself against the gentle interrogation of someone who loves you but has seen too much to be fooled by your polished lines. She let me in wearing one of her cardigans that looked like a winter sky, pale blue with a thin white trim, and she pressed my face between her hands as if she were checking whether my bones were still set correctly. Then led me to the small kitchen table where the holiday cards from years past were fanned out like trophies, the glossy parade of my absence marching in chronological order. We sat without preamble because she understands that sometimes introductions only waste oxygen, and after she poured tea she asked in that unhurried voice of hers whether I had put the little picture on her frame. And I said I had because being honest with Grandma had always felt less like confession and more like returning a library book, and she nodded as if I had rebalanced something she could not name. She did not defend my parents, which surprised me less than it should have, and instead she told a story about a winter long before I was born, a year when my grandfather had missed 2 paychecks and pride had made him pretend everything was fine, and how she had started labeling jars in the pantry because order is sometimes the only rope you can throw yourself, and then she looked at me the way people look at a person who is halfway across a shaking bridge and said that sometimes labels are not about control, but about refusing to let someone else decide what a thing is called. I stared at the parade of cards and felt something unclench, not forgiveness exactly, more like a decision to stop performing politeness for people who count your silence as agreement. I told her I had been named to a list that mattered, a real list, not one of those email scams that congratulate you on being the 1,000th customer, but that I had not told the family because I wanted, for once, to see how they behaved without the pressure of having to pretend to be proud, and when I said the name she smiled with a pride so uncomplicated it made my ribs hurt. Then she asked whether I intended to tell them now, and I said I would, but not in the way they expected. She laughed in that low way she reserves for stories where the punchline has a little venom, and she reached for my hand and squeezed it once, a baton pass disguised as comfort. After I left her building, the city felt like a chessboard I finally knew how to use. So I sat in my car and called the media buyer whose business card I had won at a charity auction years ago during a fundraiser where I had been pushed to the edge of the group photo because donors like symmetry more than truth. And when he answered with the eager tone of a person who recognizes a favor coming due, I did not bother with flattery. I told him I needed a billboard on a very specific block facing a very specific window for the week leading up to Christmas, and that I had copy, artwork, and payment ready to go before dinner, and he cleared his throat and told me that location was rarely available, but miracles happen when people pay on time. And I said I have never missed a deadline in my life, and I do not intend to start now. We negotiated the price in 5 sentences, because efficiency is the closest thing I have to religion, and he emailed a contract that hit my inbox before I could start. The car. I went home and wrote the line that had been forming in the back of my skull since the moment I saw their caption, a sentence tuned to be both announcement and indictment, playful enough to pass as cheeky yet sharp enough to leave a mark. Forbes 30 under 30, that's me. I set the typography in a way that would make my name impossible to skim past, and chose a photo that did not grovel for approval, a straight-on shot with a hint of a smile that said, I know exactly what I am doing and I am not sorry. While the proofs rendered, I scheduled a press release that did not mention my family at all but noted the display as a seasonal celebration of local talent, because the most satisfying vengeance is the kind that looks like a civic good deed from the outside. And then I queued a newsletter to my company's mailing list for the morning of Christmas Eve, a cheerful note thanking clients for their trust and including a small map with a star on a single city block, no context given. Just an invitation to look up. But I could not let the day end without a little interim measure, a small notch in the ledger while the true play moved through production. So I uploaded a post to my professional page with a carousel of behind-the-scenes shots from projects my parents had never bothered to ask about. And in the last slide, I included a cropped screenshot of the family's holiday photo with a neat red circle drawn where I would have stood if I had been invited. Not mocking, not theatrical, just a clean diagram. Titled with a single caption that made my own laugh catch in my throat. Position reserved. The comments began almost immediately. Colleagues cheering, a few acquaintances reading between the lines and sending private messages that included the kind of support people usually save for funerals, and then, buried among the notifications, a text from Matthew that read like it had been typed with a jaw wired shut, maybe stop making a scene. I stared at his words long enough to recognize the old script trying to reassert itself, and I decided to answer in a dialect he understood, so I replied with a screenshot of the billboard proof that showed my name towering over the street like a verdict. And I wrote a single sentence that contained no swears, no exclamation points, just the kind of cool clarity that makes people suddenly reconsider their footing. Scene goes up on Monday. On Monday before dawn, when the city looked like it was holding its breath and the street outside Grandma's building was still a runway of quiet sodium light, I parked half a block away with a thermos that tasted more like determination than coffee and watched the crew lift the vinyl like a sail, their gloved hands moving in practiced rhythm as if they had been preparing for this one job their entire lives. And even though I had designed the thing, sized every letter, tested it on screens and mock-ups and a scaled cardboard model I built like a school project for an adult who refuses to be graded on a curve, nothing prepared me for the moment my name unfurled across the metal ribs and settled into place with the final thwack of the tension bar. A sound that felt like a stamp, like the official seal on a document that says we recognize the existence of this person whether you like it or not. The line sat exactly where it should. Forbes 30 under 30. That's me, no apology, no exclamation, just a clean statement of fact in a font that doesn't beg for permission, and below it the headshot that made my mother once say I should smile more. A remark she considered nurturing and I considered a dare. Which is why the photo shows a smile that looks like I've already decided what happens next. I checked my watch not because I was in a hurry but because timing matters when you are staging a small domestic revolution, and I knew that Grandma's blinds would open just after sunrise since she likes to catch the pink before it slides into ordinary daylight. And I wanted to be there for the moment her eyes met the billboard, not to gloat but to make sure the first face she saw when she turned to the window would be mine, not in the photo but in the car across the street, real and breathing. and grinning like a person who finally bought a key to a door everyone insisted was purely decorative. When the slats tilted and the room filled with a stripe of color, the silhouette of her head appeared, then the unmistakable tilt of her chin when she is reading something important. And after a heartbeat the blinds lifted fully, and she pressed her hand to the glass in a gesture I have seen since childhood, the same way she used to touch the TV when a Grand Slam replayed and she wanted to bless it back into the world, and I felt my throat pinch in that ridiculous way that makes sensible people roll their eyes, except it wasn't ridiculous. It was a small private ceremony between two women who have been told their entire lives to lower their volume and have decided instead to raise the ceiling. Once the morning bus ground to a stop and passengers began noticing, I witnessed the chain reaction I had planned for but still savored like a secret recipe working on the first try. A teenage girl took a photo and showed it to her mom, who widened her eyes in that proud way strangers sometimes save for celebrities and hometown teams. A man in a camo jacket pointed up and said something to his friend that made them both laugh the way people do when they recognize a good punchline that also happens to be true. A dog barked because that is what dogs do when the world changes, even if only in the corner of their vision, and then the building's lobby door opened and out came my mother, her hair pinned the way she pins it for church. Only this was not a church, and she was not ready for the sermon, and behind her shuffled my father, who carried his shoulders like a man caught between a fire alarm and a nap. They looked up as if the sky had grown a billboard overnight, which, to be fair, it had, and I watched the numbers roll behind their faces as they calculated how many people would see it. How many neighbors and friends and well-meaning busybodies would pass judgment with the speed of a cookie exchange, and for a brief glorious second I saw my mother's mouth move around a sentence that had nowhere to land. Because there is no gentle way to ask the world to avert its eyes from the truth when the truth is 30 feet wide and sits precisely outside your mother's window. I got out of the car because hiding would have turned this into a prank instead of a statement, and I wanted them to choose whether to walk toward me or away from me in front of a public audience that had no idea they were watching a family election. Not for office, but for narrative authority, I stood by the curb and lifted my thermos in a small toast that said, "I am here, I have always been here, and I am done." Pretending my absence was polite. To put a bow on it, because a tidy flourish soothes stubborn hearts, I had scheduled a courier to deliver a framed 8x10 print of the billboard to the lobby with a handwritten note on heavy cardstock that read, without an ounce of sarcasm, "From your granddaughter. With love, and with accurate head count, and the doorman, who has seen every variety of human theater play out between packages and pizza deliveries, set it on the counter next to the poinsettia and winked at me like we were colleagues in the same beloved mischief." My phone began to buzz exactly on cue, not in the random scatter of texts I could ignore, but in those insistent stacked calls that tell you the meeting has officially left the group chat, and names bloomed across the screen. Matthew first, because of course, then Mom. Then a number I did not recognize that turned out to be a local reporter who had received my very polite press release and wanted a quote about women claiming space within family narratives, which is a sentence I could live inside for months if necessary. Before I could decide whom to answer, the lobby door opened again and Grandma stepped onto the sidewalk wearing her winter sky cardigan and a grin that would have scared a lesser opponent into confession, and she looked at me, then at the billboard, then past me down the block where a small crowd had gathered, and in the quiet that followed, a quiet only we could hear in the middle of honking and chatter and the rustle of the bus's brakes, she asked a question so simple and so heavy it hit me. Like a gently thrown brick, "Are you ready to own this when they ask why?" And as my mother finally reached me with that tight smile she uses when company is present and disaster is imminent, my phone vibrated again, this time with an unknown number flashing the name of the magazine itself, and the screen lit with a message that read, "We'd like to feature the story behind your billboard. Can you talk on record today?" The request from the magazine was still vibrating in my hand like a dare when my mother reached me with that careful posture she saves for funerals and church raffles, and before she could deploy the opening line about family belonging behind closed doors I said, very gently and without heat, that closed doors were the problem and the proof was 30 feet over her shoulder, which made my father shift his weight the way men do when they would prefer to repair a dishwasher rather than navigate emotions. And then Grandma slid her arm through mine as if we were leaving a theater at intermission and asked if we might take a walk around the block because fresh air has a way of draining poison without leaving stains. So we walked beneath the billboard while people pretended not to notice us and also failed spectacularly at pretending, and I spoke in a voice steady enough to convince myself that I had rehearsed this speech though I had not, telling them that I had never wanted to embarrass anyone, only to correct a public record that kept declaring itself complete without me, and that if they were angry it was because the medicine worked. Matthew called again as if persistence might bend physics, and I answered because allowing him to narrate me as unresponsive would have returned us to the old script. And he launched into a monologue about how real adults do not broadcast family business to the neighborhood, which was funny given that for years he and our parents had been broadcasting a version of family business that edited me out with the precision of a hairdresser trimming a bang, and when I said that out loud he sputtered, the way a faucet does when air has been trapped in the line too long. Then he muttered that I could have just asked to be in the photo, and I laughed in a way that surprised me because it sounded like relief. Telling him that begging to stand at the edge of a frame in which I still would not be seen was not a negotiation, but a costume fitting, and that I was done dressing up as the reasonable sister who bites her tongue until it bleeds and then apologizes for staining the napkins. By noon the small crowd had become a stream and the stream a river, neighbors detouring to take pictures, teenagers filming breathless explanations in front of my name as if urban legends had suddenly learned graphic design. And the doorman held up the lobby phone like a conductor's baton, announcing that reporters had called the building more times than holiday deliveries, which made Grandma chuckle because she has always believed in momentum and in the way a well-aimed snowball can start an avalanche without anyone having to shout. And when the magazine's editor finally reached me directly, I stepped aside, leaned against the cold brick that smelled faintly of winter and old paint, and said that I would talk on the record if the piece centered the idea of women naming themselves accurately in spaces that prefer them mislabeled, and that there would be no cheap villain edits of my mother or my father because we had already lived that version of the story and it was boring, and the editor, who sounded both thrilled and cautious, agreed that we could frame it as an essay rather than a profile, which felt right because I am not a character in their tableau anymore, and I am not auditioning for the part. The clever, petty part of me, the one that balances budgets and also enjoys symmetry, had prepared a final move I had not decided whether to use, a simple box wrapped in plain white paper that I carried inside after our block-long truce talk. A gift for Grandma to open in front of everyone because theater teaches better than lectures when people are addicted to appearances, and when she lifted the lid, she found a stack of past holiday cards laminated into a single sheet like a place mat, and centered on top a fresh print of this year's photo with a thin gold line drawn where I would have stood, and beneath it a second print, the same image, but amended with me added in not by Photoshop, but by that tiny sticker I had placed on frames around the city, except larger now and undeniable, and on the bottom right I had stamped a neat block of text, not snide, not loud, just tidy, accurate count, 4, +1 for the truth, and Grandma laughed so hard she cried while my mother stared at the placemat as if numbers had grown teeth, and my father said, in a voice that could have been courage if it had arrived years earlier, that maybe next year we could plan the photo together like adults who know how to count. I would like to say that this was the moment when we all hugged and the townsfolk clapped and the bus driver honked in triumph, but life prefers mess to montage, so what happened instead was a series of small negotiations that felt like moving furniture in a dim room, bumping shins and swearing under our breath without using the words we really wanted, and the afternoon stretched into that pale winter dusk where everything looks possible if you do not focus too hard, and I took a call from the editor on the stoop while my parents argued softly inside about tone and precedent, and Grandma poured cocoa as if hydration could fix story structure. And neighbors kept snapping photos until the streetlights came on and my face above them glowed like a lighthouse that refuses to dim for the comfort of boats that claim the beam is rude. The part you want, the clean reveal, the tidy confession, the single sentence that explains why my mother ignored me, or why my father deferred, or why my brother learned to stand center frame, never arrived, and maybe it never will. Because people rarely hand you a dissertation on their failings when a shrug will do, and besides, I am no longer auditioning for their explanations, which is the quietest revenge of all, more satisfying than clever quips or viral clips. The simple refusal to let someone else own the closing narration. I did, however, answer one call that mattered, and I walked outside under the billboard while the editor recorded my voice, and I said that families are not ruined by public truth, but by private omissions repeated until the omission becomes a ritual. And that my billboard was not a taunt but a correction, a label on the jar so no one could pretend the contents were something else, and I ended by thanking my grandmother for asking the only question that matters. When you choose a bigger life, are you ready to own this when they ask why? And I said yes, even though my knees shook a little, because fear is not a stop sign. Fear is a mile marker that means you have left the old neighborhood. Later, when the street was almost empty and the bus had stopped running and the doorman had locked the package room and my parents had gone upstairs to discuss next steps in the way committees discuss revolutions they intend to rename as meetings, Grandma and I stood side by side and watched a couple take a selfie with my name blazing over their shoulders, and she said, without looking at me, "That audacity looks good on me," then asked whether I would be home for Christmas dinner, and I said, that depended on whether the table was set for the accurate number, and she nodded as if we had just solved a math problem that had been haunting the family for decades, and she squeezed my hand with the same baton pass pressure as before. And I walked to my car hearing my phone buzz with a text from my mother that read, simply, "Can we talk tomorrow about the photo?" which could mean anything or nothing, and I drove away without opening it, because sometimes suspense is not a cliffhanger but a choice, and because for the first time in years I was not invisible, I was simply undecided about whether I liked what they finally saw.